This is our final plenary session. A part of our community that hates these words, but sometimes we speak about the mini-public and the maxi-public. I know a few people who hate that word maxi-public, but connecting your assembly to the outside world, but also communicating what happens inside your assembly is actually a very important but often neglected part of the assembly. So we invited Lise Deshautel to talk about this. It will be another story about France and a convention citoyenne, this time on the climate. Lise was at the center of this, being part of the organizing group in the Convention citoyenne pour le climat. So she's seen all these things from very close by. She can tell you some of the lessons learned about this. She's now working at a large French city doing the same type of work. And so she can also look from the local perspective now, having done the national one. So Lise, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yves. And thank you, everyone. I hope it will be an interesting presentation, or at least you can just nap through it. No worries, I'll try not to speak too loud. So as Yves said, I was working as an advisor to the co-president of the governance committee of the French Climate Assembly that took place in 2019, starting in October and ending in 2020 in June, at least for the first phase of the assembly. And then I had the chance to be part of the founding of the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies that was mentioned a bit earlier on, that you can find. It was in 2020 or 2021 that we realized that there was quite a lot going on with climate assemblies. They were a fast-growing phenomenon. And at the time, we felt the need to bring together the expertise, the experience of policymakers, practitioners, and academics, of course, civil society actors that were involved in those processes nationally, but also locally. And with this network, that is an open network, anyone can join, and you're not signing up for anything but a couple of emails from time to time, and being invited to learning calls and receiving publications and being able to participate in workshops. And sometimes we actually do commission reports and works to some of our members, and FIDE was also among the founding members of this network. So maybe to start shortly, in 10 minutes, that's always a challenge for me to try to summarize the big thing so I'm going to call it the CCC for Convention citoyenne pour le climat. So the CCC has been called an outlier amongst climate assemblies, and those are the words of Graham Smith, who is a professor at Westminster University, but who is also the chair of KNOCA, and in the list of resources that I've provided FIDE with, there is this article where he compares the French Climate Assembly with 5 other national climate assemblies, and he tries to outline how the design, the commissioning, the governance, the design, and the impact made this assembly a bit distinguishable from other climate assemblies that happened around a period of 3 years' time. But since then, a lot happened. We had another national citizen assembly in France, and there is much more material that we can learn from. And we've also seen that climate assemblies are a very diverse phenomenon. We tend to use the word climate assemblies for things that are very, very different. So to start with the process, first, it's quite hard to pinpoint when the whole thing started. But for sure, you have to remember that in 2018 in France, we had 2 social protests. The first one actually not being the yellow vests, but being an environmental movement that started in September 2018, not by the strike of a young Swedish girl, but by the resignation of the environment minister in France, who was at the time very famous, very well known and appreciated by the population. And he had been, let's say, a catch from President Macron when he got elected in 2017, and he managed to hire this guy as minister. Many had tried before and never succeeded. But this guy, so after a year and a half, he decided to throw the towel, and he was like, I cannot do my job. I cannot actually try work, make the planet great again, with lobbyists, with so many defensive movements that were against change and progressive green laws. So he resigned, and there was a start of some protests that were soon joined by the climate strike movement that happened throughout Europe and the world at the time. And in November, the infamous or very famous Yellow Vest movement started with the increase of the carbon tax. But behind that movement, there were lots more demands than just protesting about this increase. There were demands connected to public services or actually regarding the state of democracy, regarding transportation, etc. So in 2019, in January, after calling off the increase of the carbon tax, President Macron decides to organize and announces the Great National Debate. That was a very interesting moment also, where basically thousands of debates were organized throughout France, locally with ministers, with the president himself, but also with mayors, etc., to start have a dialogue about what is it you want. But when you do that, plus they had like what we called grievances books open in city halls where people could go and write what they wanted, let's say, in terms of changes in the country. They got over 2 million contributions. It's a bit tough to summarize. But the president had to do this press conference on April 25th of that year. It was initially scheduled, I think, a week before, but Notre Dame burned, so had to move it. It's a part of a long story of every time something was supposed to happen with the French Climate Assembly, something else was happening and we had to change the plans. So anyway, on the 25th of April, among the conclusions of the Great National Debate, he announces, sorry, is it the noise?
Yeah, a little bit that way, out of your, try again?
Yep. Is it better?
Is it better?
Sorry.
It's okay.
Just wave if it gets annoying again. So he decides, he announces this Citizens' Convention on Ecological Transition that would be made of drawn by lot citizens and that would work on this issue. At that point, the idea did not just pop up in his mind. It was something that was called for and pushed by a group of activists that was a mixture of some Yellow Vests spokespersons or individuals and some green activists that were quite close to the Yellow Vests. And they had published this op-ed saying, like, we need a citizens' assembly on democratic renewal, social justice, and the ecological transition. So by that time, he makes the announcement, and then everything goes very quickly because in the mission letter that is issued by the Prime Minister, like it was for the end-of-life assembly, there are a couple of principles that are stated and that are asked of the CESE, so the Economic, Social and Environmental Council, to organize. So firstly, to set up a governance committee of 15 members. There are 3 guarantors or overseeing people that are appointed, 1 per assembly. So 1 was appointed by the Senate, another one by the lower chamber of parliament, and the third one by the CESE. And one of them was actually a very public figure, well known as an activist, filmmaker, etc. But the 2 other ones were civil servants coming from the administration of the Senate and the Assemblée nationale. So it created an imbalance, and they played a very strange role in the process. I must also point that the governance committee decided, once the process was running, to be joined by 2 members of the assembly that were drawn by lot among a group of volunteers, and that they participated in the governance committee and contributed to the decisions. They were members, full members, but we would change them in between every session. So they would do usually 5 or 6 meetings, and then there would be 2 new ones joining. It was really an added value to also have the insider perspective, the participant perspective when we were making decisions, because we were building the program as things were going. It's not like we prepared the plan and then that was the first session. We would finish a session and start thinking, okay, what are we going to do next? Okay, this. So it was a very intense process, but it also allowed us to adapt a lot. We had 3 facilitation companies working with us. We also had a whole administration with us, with civil servants, resources. It's super helpful. Plus, we had the building in Paris where the sessions were hosted. So the remit was to, for the members to design structural measures or proposals to help us reach our climate goal by 2030 in a spirit of social justice. So this was a connection also with all the social demands and protests connected to the carbon tax. The sessions were supposed to be 5 or 6 and to be organized by January 2020. So it's a very short window of time that we had. And then members were to be drawn by lot. There were to be 150 and to be representative of France. We tended to call that a mini France. Basically, we did sortition through quota sampling from 300,000 phone numbers that were generated by software, and then people were being called, so 85% of them were cell phones, 15 were phone lines, and we had a company calling, and they had a script, and they were saying like, President Macron announced this citizen assembly, it's going to work from then to then, it's going to do that, are you willing to join? A third of the people told us yes, straight away. Another third needed some time to think about it, and then the last third was not interested. And for many members, the one that came, actually, they told us that at first, when they got the call or the text, they were thinking like it's spam. But I'll come back to that on the communication part later on. So this is it for the main features, and I'd like to say that also on the website of KNOCA you can find, we've actually tried to make it easier to compare assemblies by listing those key features, so you can compare the key features of Scotland's climate assembly with the French one or with others, etc. That, for me, sorry, it's just a souvenir, a reminder of this diversity of participants, where you have Samir, who is from Marseille, a surgeon, next to a student from the Réunion, next to a concierge in Paris, Marie-Hélène. You have 2 facilitators, a lawyer, Muriel, who was working actually in Germany at the time, but she still had a French number, so it was useful for her to, that's how she got picked up, even though she was not living in France anymore. And then it's Melanie, who was a caretaker close to the Paris region. So yeah, that's a diversity, and they were all working, if I remember well, on housing stuff at the time. So, organization of the works. Basically, those are the 7 sessions that were organized. This graph changed a lot because it was not the initial schedule. At some point, we were supposed to have a session in December, but we got some strikes. That's France, we have strikes. During winter, it's not snow like here. But anyway, then we have this big gap between March and June due to COVID. But we also had like a small interim session that does not appear here, but where we worked online. And there is another session I'll be mentioning afterwards, like the review session we organized. Like in many processes, the first 2 sessions were really about understanding the problem, the policy problem, or problems, actually. Members were distributed in 5 groups, thematic groups, about that coincided with the main sectors where we have greenhouse gas emissions in France, and they would be drawn by lot in those groups. They could not decide like, oh, I want to go in the consumption one, or I want to go in this one, etc. So you had a farmer who was actually working, I think, in the industry group and not in the farming group. They went through that. They listened to experts. We had approximately 135 external speakers that were auditioned in total. At some point, we had like a big speed dating market where they could go to one table and listen to an expert and ask questions for 15 minutes and then change table. That was interesting, very hard to organize, but also quite useful because at some point at the end of session 1, for instance, we asked them, who do you want to hear from? Not only people that we had picked as governance committee, but who they wanted to listen to. And among those people, there was this famous environment minister who resigned and came for session 3, sharing his views about what were the limitations of climate action in France, for instance. We had President Macron coming for session 4. He was supposed to come for the first one, but then he came. And that's actually when he made a statement or tried to explain that he wanted the proposals to be as ready as possible to be implemented in the law or to be transmitted to Parliament or directly applied or submitted to the population for a referendum. And he also insisted on the need for the proposals to be, let's say, economically sound, or not to consider the impacts, the economical impacts of the proposals. So basically, that was a very long process where the members drafted the proposals. We had some experts, legal experts, that prepared legal transcripts. So we had the proposal, let's say, let's ban any house that has not been renovated enough to meet certain standard or criteria by 2030. Then you would have the legal experts proposing how it could be translated by changing the law, so much more like a parliamentary amendment. Not all the proposals were translated like that, but some of them were. So the outcomes, to be a bit quicker, the outcomes were a final report of 145 proposals. All but one were adopted during the final session, the voting session in June. We had intensive media coverage, I'll come back to that. And after that, we have a very lively climate public debate over the proposals. And some of them are actually still sometimes being debated or pop up. For instance, last year with all the discussions about energy prices and sobriety, a lot of the proposals that had not been translated were brought back in the public debate by the media, saying like, what happened to those proposals? They could actually help us meet the new goals that the government is setting. So it's interesting, they have a life of their own. And there was this interim communication that we did connected to COVID. So that's a photograph of the report. That's the members coming out of the Élysée Palace. So just 1 week after the adoption of the proposals, they met with the president and they presented very generally their proposals, and then he replied directly saying, I'm taking everything but 3 proposals that I don't like. He called that jokers. And he explained why he was not taking them on board, and he said like, now I want you members to work with the members of my government and to prepare a law. So that's what they did. And that led to some work and to a law that then generated more protests over 2021 by then. And in early 2021, the French Climate Assembly met again for a last review session that was foreseen from the start, where the members were to evaluate whether they were satisfied with the way the government had handled their proposals. It was a bit hard because by that time the government had published a bill, but it was not adopted because it had to go through Parliament. And they gave an evaluation that was a bit severe. We decided to go for a notation, for a ranking system, and they said that they were satisfied 2.5 over 10, which is very bad. And then this was used by green activists in the protest calling for Parliament to make a better law than Macron had done. Okay, so I'll stop here. And we'll switch to communications, the fun and interesting part of the CCC. So to quote a certain Yves from FIDE, communication is one main driver for impact. And what you need is a robust communication strategy. So Yves, I don't know if you recall, but you've written that in a KNOCA report a couple of years ago. And saying that communication should not be an afterthought, but it's actually a significant part of the strategy connected to an assembly, and it should be a significant part of the budget. That we can debate. But I totally agree with that. And looking back at what we did with the CCC, I don't want you to think that everything was like a pure conscious thing that we're doing. Most of the time we were doing things because we had the intuition that we needed to do it, but things were happening a bit quick. But to summarize and looking back, the governance committee perspective was that we needed to do communication around the CCC, first to raise awareness and to help people understand the process. Then we needed to build the legitimacy and the trust people could have in its participants. And then ultimately, we wanted all that to help generate support for the proposals of the Climate Assembly. So everybody agreed that we needed to communicate, but in the very diverse group that the governance committee was, we had long discussions about what should we do, what we should not do, if we needed to invest more time, etc. So we had, to be honest, we had lots of tensions during the whole process. I remember meetings lasting for 6 hours just to know whether or not we were going to live stream one session or not. So that's it. When it comes to the strategy itself, we never formalized really a document. I found drafts, but we never adopted one as such. Plus, it really evolved with the time, also due to, as I said, external circumstances that happened. We had the strikes, the changes in sessions when the president came, etc. But we also had, for instance, a media leak of the proposals at the very end when the proposals were still under embargo. So many things where we had to adapt. But we've tried to follow 3 principles. The first one was we needed this communication to show that we're independent and that the communication itself was independent from the commissioning authority. That is, officially the government and the prime minister, but really the person behind that was the president. We have this political system in France where the power is actually in the hands of the president. So we needed to keep the government informed. So we had direct lines of communication and information, but we didn't want people to think that they were us and we were them. It was different. Then we wanted to be as transparent as possible about what was happening in the frame of those sessions, even though you need to balance that, of course, with the protection of your members, their privacy, their anonymity for those who didn't want to be recognized. And of course, it can be about, I'm shy, I don't want to speak to the media, but for some people, and I'm thinking about a member, she had gone through a lot of efforts to change her life, to escape an abusive partner, and she didn't want, because she wanted to participate, to be tracked down through the assembly. So it's not something that you kind of joke about, etc. It's important. And then we wanted to be very proactive, not just wait and see where things would go. We started very early on in the process to communicate. And we considered very early the idea of having members help us do that. In terms of resources, as probably you've understood from this morning, the 2 national processes in France had exceptional resources to a degree that, of course, even today, as working in a local authority, I would never dream of having that many resources. It doesn't exist. It's showing you what you can do when you have everything kind of aligned, all the means, etc. Still, it's a dream, it doesn't happen that often. And it's much more about giving you ideas than saying like, this is what you need, otherwise it's not going to work. It's not true. So in terms of budget, we actually had 5 million euros, and that's where I disagree with Yves. Budget needs to be sufficient, but it doesn't need to be that important. Actually, for us, it was the opposite. We didn't want people to think that it was only a communication operation from the government, because actually people were criticizing the president for doing the great national debates and not having any outcomes, concrete, or bringing any change. And if we had invested too much in communication, then of course people would have said like, yeah, it's just about saying that you're doing it, but not properly doing it. So that element was important. We also had a subcommittee of the governance committee that was really dedicated to, that was meeting every week, sometimes twice a week, to discuss all the communications matter, to greenlight documents, projects, etc. The members of the governance committee also used their personal contacts and resources, access to the media, etc. That was also very useful. We also had the support of the staff and the logistics of the CESA, so this institution. They even hired a community manager just to manage the social networks of the CCC and the websites. We had two actually, one for the proposal, one for the process. And we also had this company that was doing press work for the CESA that agreed to also work on this. And even one of the facilitation company who is not only doing facilitation, they had in-house support to do videos and stuff like that. So it was useful. Looking at the press work, the media strategy, there was one that was actually formalized. And we agreed that we would change the focus of our strategy and what we were trying to do. So first, it was about telling the stories of the members so that people could relate and understand the idea of drawn by lot citizens, that those were not citizens that were pre-selected or had any special knowledge beforehand. And that proved to be super useful because we started to do that very early on. During the recruitment phase, we actually had invited some TVs to come to the company where they were making, to the call center, where they were making the calls. So you had like some, in the evening news time, etc., you had some people and you could see how it worked. It was useful to have that because at some point they called a former MEP, former French-German MEP, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, a bit famous. And they were like, oh, you see, it's rigged. They're calling a green MEP. So the process is not right. Okay, the guy has 6 phone numbers. It's normal, he has more chances of being called. But we're unlucky with that. It was very useful for us to have started communication, because otherwise we could have not reacted to this. We did press releases and press conferences before the main important sessions. The guarantors, the 3 overseeing people, also did some press releases, sometimes just to say like, we are happy with that part of the process, or we are worried about this. We gave access to the media to the sessions. They could be in the room with members when they were discussing, but that's a list we established at the first session, and where we had 15 journalists, and there were media that were mainstream, that were, let's say, serious and important ones. And we had a deal with them that they would not reveal the identity of people, that they would not reveal exactly the proposals that were discussed. They could mention the themes, they could report on some, and someone said, oh, we are forgetting about this and that, but they had to respect that. And it was a long-term gamble for them, because the media, okay, if your chief is going to send you for 6 weekends and to follow that and to pay for you to work, and you don't publish a paper every time, or you cannot actually say what's happening exactly within the thing, it can be tough. And they were telling us, like, my boss is really pressuring me. But they respected the embargo, and that was important. And the members also understood that and kind of trusted the media that were there. They were more eager to answer to their questions than the other media at the end of the process. We also provided members with some support, actually, when they were answering questions to the media. Just, it's not like a big training about what they should say, but telling them you're not obliged to answer to a question, or if you don't understand the question, you can ask, and for it to be rephrased, you can say, I don't want to answer that, etc. And we had the red dot policy, where members who didn't want to be filmed, photographed, or even approached or interviewed by the press would get a red dot on their badge. And everybody knew we leave them alone. And it worked. And you also had some people that started with a red dot and at some point were more comfortable and decided to leave it out. We also had, as governance committee, and especially the co-presidents, bilateral meeting with targeted media. So it was like breakfast, coffees, lunches, where we would try to speak to influential media and journalists. And we were also trying to target journalists, not the ones that were covering climate already, but the one covering politics, the one covering economics, to try to prepare them for the end of the process, when the proposals would be out. And for us, it was really important to be able, the idea was not to get a paper right away, to talk to a media and then hope that they would publish something after. It was more getting everybody ready to explain the process once the proposals were out, because we felt that if people did not understand how those proposals were drafted and by whom, then it could create a very distorted image of the assembly. So that's a member, Samir, talking to the media. We also had targeted actions towards specific audiences. When you do communication, I think you know that the first rule is not like, you cannot talk to everyone at the same time. It doesn't work. So we were trying actually to talk to people who were already interested in climate, who were following, who could actually be aware that the process was happening. So for instance, we had this partnership with the Citoyen Reporter, that are like a group of media activists. They were a bit in between, and they were on board in the process, and they were actually very connected through social media to young groups. It was, for us, quite useful to reach people that we could not reach through the traditional media. Then we tried to make everything available. Also, the material that was provided to the members and the presentations. We had a very famous presentation from an IPCC member that was actually very shocking for the members. It's when they realized how bad the climate crisis was. So we put that online. We had podcasts of some hearings, etc. Then, as I said, we informed the government. We had separate channels of information. We also had a set of actions towards the parliament and parliamentarians. So we had information breakfast. We gave them access to the sessions. And that's actually this picture. It's a group of parliamentarians that came and listened to the debate. Not all the sessions were accessible and could be listened to, especially not the group discussions, but sometimes when they had the hearing of a couple of experts, we would open it and people could come and just register and listen to the debates and see the debates among them. So those were parliamentarians. That's the economy minister sitting up front. And I remember one of the parliamentarians getting out of the session and saying, like, if we had this quality of debate in the French parliament, the state of the country would be much better. Okay, it didn't prevent him from voting against the law afterwards, but anyway. So we also had some work, and we sent, for instance, the press package at the beginning to the main trade unions, environmental NGOs, but also companies, the main trade associations, stuff like that, and we met with them more to explain the process, to mention and to say, like, hey, people, be aware that this is happening, because ultimately there will be proposals and your sector could be impacted. And then we had some ad hoc initiatives, so I'm not going to... So for instance, we hired a cartoonist to listen to the debates and to make some fun cartoons saying, like, oh, for God's sake, we still have 15 minutes left to write something that will enter history. Let's try and not have any typo. Stuff like that. That was then used online and used in the media. Very useful. So I'm not going to play that, but that's another example of... Oh, shit. Yep. So, for instance, we had photograph artist, JR, do portraits of the members, and then they were placated on the building to thank the members and to make it more visible. But we also had own initiatives of the members. For instance, here on the right, that's a letter that was drafted by the members that were between 16 and 18 in the assembly, and they wrote to Greta Thunberg just to say like, hey, we're working on that, and we've been listening to you, and if you want to pass by in France and come to the assembly, we'll be very happy to welcome you. They did that, they sent it, and then they were like, maybe you should send it to the media to let them know that we've done that. It was an own initiative of the members. Then you had La Convention Climat s'exporte hors les murs. It's actually, they decided to organize what they call the Climapéro. So it's like drinks over climate, and they've done that in several parts of France. Just like, oh, I'm living in this neighborhood, you too, let's have a debate. We can go to this bar, and maybe we can invite an expert, and then we can tell people what we're doing in the process. That was during the process. A lot more happened afterwards. Afterwards, they actually created this organization, Les 150, that was the association to try to stay together, that had different purposes. For some of them, they wanted to just share their proposals, they wanted to lobby for their proposals, they just wanted to talk about the process. They had different purposes, and ultimately they fell out a bit, and some of them do not speak to each other anymore. That's also the problem when you take off facilitation. And then this book, I, Citizen, from a member of the Assembly who explained and published this book about his whole experience. So basically the outcome is an extensive media coverage. At the very end, the last session was crazy. I've been in politics for a couple of years. You kind of dream of having a debate in Parliament where the TV is outside and they're saying like, and now they're about to vote on this proposal. It never happens. It's not like a football game. But that happened for the Assembly. It was quite incredible. And we had some polling showing that 7 out of 10 French people had heard about the proposals. There was an important support. A majority is actually in support of the proposals and considering that the process was, had some legitimacy. So to sum up, and to stop here. On the left, it's just an idea, it's a number of tweets about the French Climate Assembly per day. So it doesn't show, but actually this is already quite important for something that's a UFO, usually on social media. Nobody knows what a citizen assembly is until one has happened in a country. But you can see that it's really when the process ended and the proposals were published that the peak happened. So do not exhaust yourself trying to raise too much attention on the thing. You need to prepare for the landing of the assembly. There is no need to say like the process is happening. You're working for the future. And then here, it's actually also trying to show that when you look at the media coverage of different climate assemblies, most of the coverage, aside from Scotland, happens once the process is over. But then it's also, and you can see that before the process happens, not so many people have heard about it. It's quite hard, and this one is connected to the population number. I can't remember why I did that, but to show that the early on assemblies were not covered that much, but then it started to grow, and Austria, they've done a pretty good job because I think they actually learned from the other processes. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.